But Nick, maybe you can tell us about Josephus, very famous first century Roman Jewish Greek historian. Um, who was he,
Sure.
and very briefly, and why is he talking about Hades, this Greek concept, and what is his take?
Yep. So Josephus is, or his Hebrew name would be Joseph, Yosef. He fights against the Romans in the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70 CE, and he's captured. Obviously, the Judeans lose to the Romans, and their temple is burned and Jerusalem's destroyed in the year 70. And Josephus is conscripted by a Roman family, the Flavians. So sometimes he's referred to as Josephus Flavius or Flavius Josephus. And he writes several different volumes on this family's behalf. And one of the things that he writes about is this little text that scholars call On Hades. It's like a little excursus. And I'll just read the beginning, the first paragraph to you to give you a sense of what Josephus thinks of when he thinks of the afterlife uh, called Hades in Greek. Again, this goes back to the Hebrew idea of Sheol. The Greek Hades is just a Jewish translation of Sheol. So Josephus says, now as to Hades, wherein the souls of the righteous and unrighteous are detained. By the way, that word for souls is psyche. It's very fun to say. Don't think of it in terms of like some wishy-washy wisp or something that lives in your chest cavity. Psyche can either be translated soul or life. Like the story of like if you hear like, the antiquated terminology, like not a soul was stirring. It doesn't mean an ethereal wisp or vapor. It's a person. So there's this idea of embodiment, physical embodiment in Hades for Josephus. So he says, now where the psyche, the lives of the righteous and unrighteous are detained. That means everybody goes there after they die. So he says it's necessary to speak of this place. He says Hades is a place in the world not regularly finished. That is, it's disorganized in there. And he says it's a subterraneous region. It's under the earth, wherein the light of this world does not shine. From which circumstance that is in this region light does not shine, it cannot be there, but must be in perpetual darkness. Now we can get to that in a second. Don't worry, Sheol is not completely dark. Josephus makes this clear later on. But the last sentence that's important here, this region is allotted as a place of holding, of custody, I would say of holding for lives, in which angels are appointed as guardians to them, who distribute to them temporary punishments agreeable to everyone's behavior and manners. Now, just really, really briefly, here's the bit about Gehenna. In this region, in Sheol, there's a certain place set apart as a lake of unquenchable fire. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like Revelation. Whereinto we suppose no one has hitherto been cast. So sorry for the antiquated terminology, but what Josephus is saying is, yes, there's a lake of fire. There's a Gehenna in this area, but no one's in there yet. Josephus is going to go on to say, no, we're raised from the dead. And then people go into Gehenna, or the righteous go into God's everlasting kingdom, which has come to this earth. Also not unlike Revelation. In Revelation 21, there's talk of the New Jerusalem coming down to earth. That's what the idea in Josephus's in Josephus's mind.
Thank you, Nick. I mean, I
Yeah.
have a question as I hear that. I mean, I'm wondering how much of that comes from the Hebrew civilization and culture and literature, and how much comes from Greek. But we'll get into that. Let's leave that as an open question. It's
Okay.
fascinating how Josephus describes that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can go to the second slide, where I mean, maybe I'll just briefly mention. I think we maybe even talked about this last time when we had a
Mm-hmm.
seminar. This is from Hesiod, who provides a kind of standard mythology in the Greek world, then later in the Greco-Roman world, because it's adopted and synthesized with Roman gods. So this mythology of how the world came to be, cosmogony, says that at first there was chaos, which is a god in the Greek mentality, but the idea of chaos at the beginning is very similar to what we find in Genesis in the Hebrew Bible as well. Then Gaia, Earth, um, uh, and then Dim Tartarus, which is another Greek god, but it means the abyss. It's again reminiscent of the very beginning of Genesis, and I know we'll get to Tartarus very soon, in the depth of the wide pathed Gaia. That means there's a deep abyss or deep underworld that's somehow related to Earth. And Eros love. So Hesiod is going to go through all of the different gods, which are symbolic of all of the different features of the universe that one can observe. And then he goes through the history of what they do. And another one that comes later is strong Hades, the underworld. So at a certain point, Hades and Tartarus become almost synonymous with regard to the underworld. But actually, originally, as we'll see in some texts, there's the earth, and then there's Hades, and then Tartarus even further below. And you see that Hades is pitiless in heart, dwelling under the earth. So we'll discuss that perhaps. And then, of course, Zeus in the Greek conception. So if we just keep that in mind, one really important thing for the Second Temple period is to see how Hebrew Sheol becomes Hades in Jewish Greek. So Nick, you were talking about this. Maybe you can just take us through this slide.
Sure. So this is Psalm 16:10. It gets so it's originally in Hebrew. You will not abandon my soul or life, really, nefesh, in Hebrew. It won't abandon my life to Sheol. So that's Hebrew, and then the Greek translation is "You will not abandon my life, psyche, to Hades." So you can see that there's a one-to-one translation here. In Greek, Sheol becomes Hades, and then this follows in the New Testament, quoted in Acts 2:27, "You will not abandon my life, psyche, to Hades."
I see. Thank you. So basically, are they using these as exact equivalents, or is it a kind of symbol or reference?
It's a good question. I wish I had Luke to talk to about that. You can't be sure, but the only thing that we can do is put our eyes on the text, and based on the translational position of Hades, it's a Greek word, right? Hades predates the idea of Hades certainly predates the New Testament, and indeed predates the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So
For
in that
sure.
way, it is a Greek idea, but it's the best that these ancient Jews could do in approximating the idea of Sheol.
Hmm. It's so interesting too with regard to the question about Josephus, because Josephus seems to draw some things from the Hebrew concept of Sheol, and other things in that description that you read are very reminiscent of Hades.
Yes.
So we'll get to that. But before we look at the geography of the underworld, perhaps, let's just think a little bit about how ancient peoples saw this world, particularly in the Mediterranean, in the ancient Near East. Um, Cindy, this is your area. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. That will help us then understand what they think of when they look up and when they look down.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to think about, because we often talk about these mythologies as something that is hard to believe. How could people believe that to be true? And we forget that it stems from their actual physical experience of the world. So as we're talking about the Hebrew Bible in particular, but even some of these other Mesopotamian origin stories and myths and understandings of the world, we have to understand. And I was going to draw on this, but I don't get I'll just use the cursor. Can you see the cursor okay?
I
Oh, no, you don't see my
I don't
cursor.
see your cursor, but Nick does.
Uh,
But
no, he
tell
doesn't.
us, tell us. Okay, tell
I'll
it.
use my words.
Yeah, I'll try
It's
to.
okay.
I'll try to draw a little if I understand where you're.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well,
Uh,
let's start over by the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf is to the far right of the screen and is where the Tigris and Euphrates, yep, exactly, where the Tigris and Euphrates, they drain it down into the Persian Gulf. And so if we go from the Persian Gulf and we follow the Tigris and Euphrates to the northeast up to the top portion of the Mediterranean Sea, and then come down the shoreline of the Mediterranean Sea past the land of the Bible, exactly, and then following the Nile River as it actually flows north, but follow the river down south to its origin. this area right here is what we always refer to as the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of civilization in this area. The big powerhouse communities here are the ones along the rivers. So Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates, and Egypt with the Nile. Now, why that is so significant is something I cover in my class, because even just understanding this picture and this map and the setup of the Fertile Crescent is hugely important for understanding mindset. But what we see a lot through the Hebrew Bible, the ancient Near East, is it's the communities that are here along the Fertile Crescent who were most often in communication with each other. So these were the primary trade routes, these were the primary trade partners, the primary armies going to war with each other. And the way they understood their world to be was anchored in their geography. So we're going to focus primarily up on Mesopotamia, so the northern part of that Fertile Crescent.
Can I just say, Cindy, can I just interject
please.
one thing? I mean, this looks a lot like some maps I've seen of Abraham's travels, for example.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of debate actually about whether Abraham came from this or down here or somewhere else, maybe up here.
Right.
But essentially, the idea is very clear that even, you know, in a narrative in Genesis, this is the land that we're talking about, what we've already
That's right.
outlined in just 2 minutes.
That's right.
So fascinating.
And it gets even better when you think about Abraham, because if the powerhouse communities are where the rivers are, so Mesopotamia and Egypt, and if Abraham is starting in Mesopotamia and God says, I'm calling you into a very mountainous region, and then he goes down into Egypt, into another powerhouse community, and God brings him out, you know, we have Jacob, of course, goes back up to Mesopotamia. Jacob's descendants go down into Egypt. So there's an awful lot of play throughout all of Genesis. And yet God keeps saying the place I want you to be is in the almost inconsequential place right in the middle, which has its own strategy and speculation behind it. But we digress. Although it's easy for me to digress there because I think it is so fun. But you're
It's sort
right.
of related to the topic of the Hebrew Bible also.
Yeah, yeah. But let's go back up into Mesopotamia because their geography, the way that their land looks, their experience within the land is what shapes their view of the shape of the land, like how they understand the cosmos. It comes from their experience of the land. So you have these really tall mountains that are all to the north and to the west of all of the area of Mesopotamia, right? Those are the mountains that the Tigris and Euphrates basically drain all of the water from the mountains and then pull it to the south to the Persian Gulf, what we call Persian Gulf now. So the people, so when we're thinking of their experience of the world, and this is a little bit tricky because we have modern brains, right? We've been through a lot of developments in technology. We have people currently in space. We've seen pictures of the globe, of the world. So we understand our world as something that is spherical. Without that kind of technology, you have to think of the ancient people. They can see the world and perceive the world around them. So they look up and they can see the sky and they see the mountains that go up and touch the sky, right? And they are traveling just enough around their world to know that there's salty waters on either side, right? The Persian Gulf, if we're talking Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea are salty waters. So they're perceiving their world around them. And then when they have these origin stories and they're trying to think through how did we get to where we are? How does the world exist here? Where do the gods exist? They use their physical understanding of the world as their basis. So this is tricky for us, our modern minds, to get around because we're very accustomed to looking down, almost like we are right now with this map. We're looking down onto Mesopotamia. And we forget we have to think about all of these things as if our feet were rooted on the ground and we're looking up. So the earth being the teacher to us of the greater structures. So, which then is interesting because this is why we end up with flood stories, because the Tigris and Euphrates often flooded, the Nile flooded, so we get Egyptian flood stories as well. So there's a lot of this like uncontrollable chaos being associated with water because they can't control this water. And so the real physical world becomes the context for these more mythological stories, which is why I think we always need to start here before we talk about the stories.
It's so interesting. Sorry to interrupt again, but I
No, it's
mean,
great.
the very beginning of Genesis, "Ve'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu," the earth was formless and void, chaotic, unformed, chaotic and unformed. This is Genesis, the Hebrew Bible, not the Mesopotamian narratives or the Egyptian ones. And then it says, "Veruach Elohim," the spirit of the well, Elohim is usually translated God, although that's not necessarily always the best translation. But the spirit of the divine was sort of fluttering or hovering upon the surface of the waters, which is so interesting. You see that you have kind of that same issue of the waters and chaos, but also the involvement of the spirit of the creator, the creative force, which is a bit different from the Greek mythology. We talked about this in the last seminar where chaos gives birth to everything, kind of. And it's unclear if there's any, single mind behind it all. It just kind of all develops out of chaos. But so the Genesis story, I think, is very closely related, but also has this key element that's different. And I think that's so often the case with Jewish and Greek concepts in the ancient world, or Jewish and, ancient Near Eastern, ancient Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern concepts, as we'll maybe see when we look at the Underworld. Just my 2 cents to throw in there,
Great.
because it was so exciting to hear about this way of looking at things. But how are you going to continue? Please do.
Well, so I wanted to kind of set the framework here and then say we actually have a picture of how Babylon in particular saw themselves. Like, so the oldest map that we have that humans have created is the ancient map of the world, which we call it the Babylonian Map of the World, which is absolutely fascinating because it in the way they choose to draw the world for us, we can see the way that we can see evidence of them looking at their physical world around them. And we can also see how it's portraying their view almost of the cosmos. So this is a really interesting text. It has writing that is up at the top of the tablet. There's also writing on the flip side, on the back side of the tablet as well. And I'll come to that in a minute. We're looking at the picture that is down below. And so you'll see it almost looks like the way that children draw the sun now, like a circle with all of these points coming off of it. That circle, so the double lines there forming the circle right in the middle of the tablet, that has been, yep, exactly where your pen is. That circle all the way around. Yep. Those are labeled.
Not a very good circle, sorry. But
it
it's hard
gives
to
us a
pronounce.
place to look, though. It's good. That particular circle is labeled the bitter waters. So we see how the map of the world, they're going to put themselves right in the middle of the map. And so there's an understanding that on the outside, on the periphery, they're surrounded by bitter waters. And so you're already starting to see how they are framing the world like a disc. And so we have a disc with the waters that are around it. Now we have a parallel line that comes right. So if we're talking inside the bitter waters, coming from the top of the circle down to the bottom, there's a parallel line there. Exactly. Yep. That right there is the Euphrates River. The city of Babylon yeah, exactly. I'm loving watching the artwork appear before my eyes. There's a rectangle that is going across the Euphrates right there, and that is labeled Babylon. And Babylon did, in fact, it spanned the eastern and western side of the Euphrates River. When we get down to the Euphrates River at the bottom, there's another rectangle, and it's labeled in two different ways. So, yep, on the right-hand side of that rectangle, it's labeled the swamp. And then on the left-hand side, it's the outlet. So they're understanding that we get this kind of boggy mess, swamp land right at the base of the Euphrates, although the Euphrates then also drains down into the salty waters of what we now call the Persian Gulf. All of the little tiny circles that are around this design, still inside the bitter waters, these are all labeled, almost all of them are labeled, some of them we can't read anymore. But those little circles are either people groups or primary cities. So what we're seeing is the Babylonians see themselves as being in the center of the world, like everyone does. You know, if you look at all ancient maps, even old maps of the United States, we used to draw them with the United States in the center of the map, right? And then China was on the east and western sides, which doesn't make any sense. But we're seeing the same thing. They see themselves as being in the center of the world. They spatially understand where all these other people groups are that they know of. They're surrounded by the bitter waters. And then these triangular pieces that are on the far outside, they're just labeled as regions. And they're labeled in such a way that it could hold a mythological connotation to it. It is generally understood that the Babylonians assumed these were the mountains, maybe holding up the sky, that were mythological places that are the unknown regions. And on the back side of the tablet, it says, and no one has penetrated inside those regions. So there's like the unexplored places, the places we don't quite understand. But they have them pictured there on the outer edge of the bitter waters. Now, what's then also really fascinating is on the back side, when you're reading the inscription, there's all of these descriptions of different animals that live in different places, and some are in the bitter waters, and some of them are like half human, half animal creatures that seem to live maybe in these other regions. And all of the list of animals mimic a lot of the animal names that are mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So this kind of the origin stories, the birth of the world, and we're seeing them labeled here on this map of the world as to where they would live. So it's just an interesting way for us to get a glimpse into the ancient mindset of how they would have pictured their own world.
Yeah, definitely their world. And then that raises the question of what's above it, what's below it. You started to
Exactly.
talk about that, you know, in both directions, and we'll see from their texts a little bit more. I mean, we're going to look at Greek texts mainly, but and Jewish texts. But this is a kind of general Mediterranean, Near Eastern mindset that probably carries across in, you know, more or less to a whole bunch of peoples and across hundreds or even thousands of years. So thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting illustration from a broken stone here.
Yeah.
Amazing how much we can read from it even now.
Shalom, I'm here to invite you to come with us on a journey of discovery into the Jewish context and culture that will forever change the way you read and interpret the Bible. As you slowly go through our self-paced, on-demand program in Jewish studies relevant for Christians, you will gain ability to discover the original meaning of the biblical texts. You will see the nuance hidden behind our best and faithful translations, and to interpret these ancient texts in their original meaning. At Israel Bible Center, we provide you with the state-of-the-art, simple-to-use technology. This way, you can study on your own from the comfort of your own home, even towards your certificate in the Jewish context and culture. This study will strengthen your ministry as you continue to serve God. We will guide you through our large collection of crash courses by our fascinating faculty and roundtable talks with leading world scholars, our weekly Israel Bible magazine, as well as Israel Bible podcast that focuses on the land of Israel, will assist us along the way. We believe that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be carefully reread.
Click the link and register today to our wide variety of biblical courses.